we can start. Oh, one more arrived. Hey. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Kate Rybczynski, and on behalf of the University of Waterloo Department of Economics, I'm delighted to welcome you to our first alumni talk of 2017 and our very first webinar ever. Speaking today is Martha Justus, Chief Economist, Labour Market Intelligence for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and also University of Waterloo Economics alumnus. Martha completed her BA in Applied Economics at the University of Waterloo before obtaining her Master's in Economics at McGill University. She's worked as a director at Infometrica and at Citizenship and Immigration Canada, now Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, where she has risen through the ranks to her current Chief Economist position. Martha is generous with her feedback at academic conferences, and in coordinating our first webinar with all the technical glitches that arose in this process, I can say that she's also very patient and generous in this regard as well. So, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome, and please everyone join me in welcoming Martha Justus.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon, virtually. What I want to talk about this afternoon, I'll get that right. Kathleen asked me to talk about facilitating, how maybe I could give you some ideas about facilitating your transition from school to the workforce. So I'll give you a sense of what I think helped me, and as a consequence may help you. I obviously can't guarantee that, but hopefully you'll find a nugget in what I have to say this afternoon. As Kathleen has mentioned, I did my undergrad at the University of Waterloo. I started a long time ago in 1982 and finished in 82, so I started in about 78. Before that, I went to an international school called Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific, which is where I first found an interest in economics. I had a really good prof there who was Australian, and I thought originally I would do something in the sciences, but found economics much more inviting, I should say, particularly comparative analysis, high-level macroeconomics. After Waterloo, I went to McGill in Montreal, where I learned how to converse in both English and French, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, I actually started at McGill in 1983, but as you can see from this slide, I didn't finish my MA, and at that time a paper was the only option. I didn't finish until 1992, and my first piece of information for you is don't do that. It took me 10 years to complete my thesis paper because I started to work full-time in 1984. I would highly recommend that you finish all MA work, be it coursework or thesis, before you enter the workforce on a full-time basis. Part-time works, but full-time, no. I also want to highlight a couple of features of my co-op jobs from when I was at Waterloo, because it gives you a sense of a direction that started fairly early for me. My first co-op job was with the Department of Regional Economic Expansion. That's a federal government department, and it's now called industry, science, and economic development. So at that point, I generated a database that looked at characteristics of communities across the country. At that time, we had roughly 1,100 communities large enough to have things like libraries, swimming pools, that sort of thing. And we collected all that information and put it in one place. I then went back to school, and my next work term was with the Ontario Ministry of Treasury and Economics. It's now called Ontario Finance. And I worked on agricultural industry policy questions, but focused quite a bit on the Ontario labor market. We also looked at Ontario-Quebec relations. I worked there for 2 terms, had a really good flavor for Toronto, and then came back to Ottawa for my 4th work term, and worked at a company called Infometrica for a 4-month work term. And then after I finished my undergrad, I was lucky enough, because 1981-82 was a time of quite serious recession in Canada. But because I had worked there, I was able to get a job at Infometrica on a full-time basis. And what we did was we developed initially a database, because we didn't have comprehensive economic data at the provincial level. So we developed a database to support a model that would allow us to forecast provincial detail at the industry level. So first we built a database, and then we did a lot of econometric estimation of the model infrastructure. A couple of key things to take away from this slide is I did a lot of database work, and a lot of that was related to industrial and labor market analysis. Now, I stayed at Infometrica for about 14 years. I went from being a student to becoming the director of the National Forecast Service, which was supported by something called the Infometrica model. It was the largest econometric model describing the Canadian economy ever developed in the country. The company doesn't exist anymore because the primary owners of the company are no longer working. The model lives on, though. It was purchased by the Canadian government and lives at Environment Canada and at Natural Resources Canada. The reason the model doesn't exist beyond that anymore is because it's very expensive to maintain an econometric model that has so many data requirements underneath it. Sorry about that. Now, that's not a particularly important message at this time, but over time you will find that data becomes expensive or becomes very inexpensive, which is the reality right now with open data. And I think that's a very positive step forward for more detailed data analysis to support policy development. We'll come back to that. So I did a lot of getting my hands dirty with data and econometric modeling and supporting the development of assumptions for baseline econometric forecasts, for doing alternative scenario work, which lets you ask questions. Well, what would happen if interest rates changed, if somebody built a very large major project like a hydro dam, or if the government changed its taxation policy, all those kinds of things. We also wrote a lot of commentary on government policy, and we also communicated through workshops, seminars, etc., and other written material to clients. And that gave us a really good foundation for trying to work with clients to consider alternative futures and to look at how their businesses might be impacted by those alternative scenarios. Our clients were a lot of federal government departments, the employment department, the finance department, the energy department, the industry department. But we also had foreign governments as clients who were interested in investing in Canada, the Japanese in particular. We also worked very closely with industry associations, the Construction Association, Agricultural Association, a lot of energy-related activities, and also we dealt with very large private sector enterprises, things like Ontario Hydro, or Hydro One I guess it is now, Manitoba Hydro, TransCanada Pipelines, other large energy companies, but also companies like the CBC, who were interested in understanding what their cost structure might look like in the future. Because we were able to support a very large model, we had a lot of information that would allow us to examine the demographic evolution of the country, likely labor market evolution, various government policies, including monetary and fiscal policy, but also transfer policies, because we had a very keen interest in provincial realities and choices. We also did a lot of work, and I did a lot of work on energy investment analysis, but also price shock questions, which led, of course, over the years to examination of environmental impacts and policy changes. We also did some work on housing. So again, databases and how to look at data and use it effectively was a very significant focus of my career at least during the first 14 years so far. And we used that data to develop indicators for specific challenges. So energy efficiency indicators. We looked at the quality of human development at the provincial level. Canada was always said to be very high on the Human Development Index, and so we asked the question, well, is that true at the provincial level? We looked at labor market inclusion for many subpopulations, including Aboriginal populations, subpopulations, subgroups, the elderly, seniors, youth, what have you, within the Canadian labor market. And we often relied on very detailed, what I would call production function analysis, input-output analysis, to say what drives a particular result when we look at it, and how do price movements affect those combinations of activities and those combinations of both labor and capital, and how they affect particular groups within the economy. We also were asked to review research findings of others. Now, that's not unlike academic work, where we always want to move forward, and that was a particular function that I always enjoyed. In February of 1998, I thought it was time for a change. And so, let's just see here. Whoops. I moved. I decided that it was time to, rather than look at large macro numbers, start to look at a particular area in more depth. But when I did that, I remembered where my expertise so far had been developed. And that was in labor market results for people. I had been very active in working with what's now Employment and Skills Development Canada, and help them produce forecasts of economic prospects by occupation, and work with them to develop provincial forecasts of the same thing and to try to come to some consensus. So I took that expertise to, at the time it was Citizenship and Immigration Canada, but I also took my empirical skills. And it's important to remember that in 1998, immigration was not a front page topic of interest. So I got in, if you'll let me use the expression, on the ground floor of immigration research. And we didn't have a great deal of data to support immigration research in the late 90s. So a lot of the strategic research that we undertook was to try to put together information that would support multidisciplinary research on the economic front, certainly, as well as the demographic and labor market fronts, but also to look at social implications of immigration and cultural implications. Now, to do that means that you can't use straightforward research methodologies that had been the standard for economic analysis or for sociological or labor market analysis. And instead we had to adapt research methodologies to examine immigration in a light that's slightly different than how you would examine the demographics, for example, of the Canadian born. Because you have to take into consideration not only how old someone is, but how long they've been in the country, or how well they speak the official language, English or French, because this influences how they're received and how they find work, how they succeed at work. So we had to modify methodologies and develop data sets that would allow us to look at how we could help the integration processes of newcomers. So I did a lot of building data sets and looking at labor market realities for newcomers. As time went on, the federal government became more and more interested not only in empirical evidence, but what they call performance measurement. And that is, they wanted to actually quantify how well policies and programs that are aimed at a particular group or domain actually function. So we were asked to measure what is the value of our immigration selection policies in terms of quantifiable results. So at the time, our senior management turned to the strategic research group to say, well, let's use all this data that you have developed to quantify those results. So we became much more focused on particular outcomes and wanted to be able to measure not only economic results but sociological and cultural results. In order to do that, we sought a lot of help from the academic community in order to be certain that we were, to be blunt, doing a good job and making sure that we were keeping abreast of current trends, current methodologies, what have you, not only in the economic sphere, but also in the sociology field, as well as some statistical areas, and for sure in the data analysis area. So I did that up until about 2 years ago, and I decided again it was time for a change. I think I get a little wanderlust about every 14 years. So what I did was I talked to a few people, and there was a desire to increase the awareness and use of labor market information within Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Now, we are not an employment ministry, but immigration is now seen as one of the tools that can be used to offset labor market needs as more and more baby boomers retire. So for all of you who are Canadian born, demand for your skills is likely to rise, and the same can be true for those of you who are immigrants to this country or international students and are thinking about remaining in the Canadian labor market to make your way after school. So increasingly, immigration ministers are asking questions about how can immigrants help Canada's labor market over the coming decade or two. And so what we're trying to do is to begin to look at labor market information, not from a general perspective, but specifically from a subpopulation perspective, and that is immigrants. And how are characteristics of immigrants different from the characteristics of the Canadian born? So what does all of that mean for you and your transition to the labor market? What I'd like you to take away from what I have said falls into 4 categories that I've put on this slide. So what was helpful for me? Having work experience was very helpful for me. So having had the co-op experience allowed me to find a job much more easily when I left school. In fact, when I first left school, we were in the midst of a pretty terrible recession, and I think the only reason that I got a job quickly was because I had some work experience and very pragmatic work experience in terms of labor market and data usage. I also think that applied economics is very marketable in the workforce because it allows you to think about not only the course allows you to not only think about the theoretical aspects of economics, but also gives you a handle on some of the tools that are extremely useful in the workforce, particularly in the business world, but also increasingly in the government world, where performance measurement and how do you quantify results is becoming increasingly important. I also think that economics is a very good discipline to help with problem solving. There is a structured process to coming up with answers to questions. More particularly, I'm biased. I'm a macroeconomist in most people's definition. And being able to see things from what I'm going to call 30,000 feet, you can call it 10,000 meters, whatever you want. I'm a little old school in that regard. But being able to see the forest for the trees is really helpful. So being able to step back and see how pieces fit together is very important. A major pitfall to avoid is basically to not be afraid of numbers. Many people who have pursued economics programs often tell me, oh, I didn't take econometrics because I was afraid of math. Okay, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take quantitative analysis. Learning how to present information to people is really valuable. It doesn't mean you have to be a statistical guru. You don't have to understand all the ins and outs of survey design or representativeness. There are all kinds of people who enjoy those specifics, those very precise domains of statistical methodology. But it is valuable to understand basically how quantitative pieces fit together, sort of how you can identify whether or not a problem is a big problem or a little problem, and then move forward to examine in more detail using qualitative results and qualitative methods to examine specifics in more detail. I'm not a quantitative economist to the exclusion of qualitative analysis. I'm a big fan of qualitative analysis because often it's the strongest way to get really good ideas about directions to take policy. What are the obstacles that I have found as I tried to become an economist within both business and government worlds? The location of economists, big groups of economists, is fairly concentrated within Canada. Governments are very large employers of economists, as are very large companies, particularly financial companies, which suggests that Toronto and Ottawa are very key locations for economists to find work. So if you don't like Ottawa or you don't like Toronto, your opportunities may be more limited. The only reason that I point this out is because you need to be aware. That doesn't mean that you can't find a job with business somewhere else. I'm not saying that, because there are lots of opportunities in large companies all across the country, but you do have to look harder to find them. There's also an obstacle for many of you, which is specific to government. If you want to progress beyond a junior position, bilingualism is becoming increasingly important within the federal government and to some extent within the Ontario government as well. Being able to speak French is valuable. Often employers, particularly the federal government, will train you, but you have to know that you should take that training early in order that it doesn't thwart your career. Opportunities that I have found in my undertakings as an economist. The opportunity to work in a multidisciplinary environment I have found very refreshing, because I find that it's a very real world activity. Also, it has allowed me to look at and use techniques from other disciplines within an economic framework. So those are my takeaways for you, and I suspect as well that many of you may be interested in knowing a little bit more about immigration and what we know about immigration and where things are going. So I have a couple of slides to whet your appetite and maybe have you, if you're interested in immigration, follow up with me. I'm happy to talk to anybody and everybody about how we can move this particular domain of economic research forward. People have regularly asked me how are immigrants performing in the Canadian economy. And the reality is that recent immigrants, especially those with fairly robust educational backgrounds, have not done as well as immigrants who came in the 60s and the 70s. So we see that they have here on the chart, the blue line indicates that they have higher unemployment rates. The red line indicates that participation within the labor force is somewhat weaker than is the case for the Canadian born. And also employment rates for newcomers are again weaker than what we see for the Canadian born. Now, we also see that varies over time and in times of recession. Just like any other new labor market entrant, migrants have a harder time. Going a little deeper, I'm looking on this slide at compensation for employment. And so we're looking at wage gaps between immigrants and the Canadian born. And what we see is that they're at their highest levels since about 2006, and that there has been little or no improvement since the recession in 2009. Now, we see that the longer you've been in Canada, that is the green line, which is here for established immigrants, that is people who have been in Canada for more than 10 years, the discrepancy is less than those for who've only been here 5 to 10 years, or particularly those who've only been here for less than 5 years. One thing though to keep in mind is that as time passes, the level of earnings of all immigrants from all categories improves, and newcomers begin to look like the Canadian born after about a decade in Canada. The other thing to look at is that what happens is very nuanced by there are high performing groups and there are lower performing groups. So people that we select based on the immigration point system do much better than people who are not selected based on their human capital skills. So you can see on this chart, I've put here the Canadian average entry employment earnings. So this is when you join when a newcomer joins the labor market. And you can see that there's a purple mountain on the far right, which represents the Canada Experience class. And there are a couple of red lines which indicate provincial nominees and skilled workers. And these people do fairly well immediately after arrival. The same cannot be said for those people who arrive in the family class or who are the spouses or dependents of economic principal applicants. And also we find that refugees experience entry-level earnings that are below the Canadian average. But do remember what I said, and that is that over time, all groups see improvement in their earnings. So I can, I think, let you guess why some people do better at the outset than others, and in fact do better over time. So this demonstrates how skilled workers, provincial nominees, and what we call the Canadian experience class do over time. So for all of them, you can see that average employment earnings after each subsequent year of being in Canada improves. That means that these lines move up to the right. Now, I will point out that the line that takes a dip after year 8, which is for provincial nominees, there are some special anomalies in that group, so I wouldn't read too much in the fact that the value falls after year 8. It was a very small cohort that had very specific characteristics, so let's just ignore that. But what is interesting as well is that the dashed green line, which represents all migrants, also moves up and to the right. And so, on average, it takes about 10 years or so for migrants to make wages that are commensurate with those of the Canadian born. So what helps? Being able to speak an official language helps a lot. As well, if you have prior Canadian work experience, we find that those two characteristics are the best predictor of how well you do when you first arrive. But over time, not unlike the Canadian born, your education and age, which is the same as saying that if you as a new entrant to the labor market probably see your income rise the longer you're in the labor market, those are the best predictors of earnings for migrants in the long run. We did this analysis to support the changes to the immigration selection system that were introduced in 2015. We worked with some colleagues at Statistics Canada, and we used these findings, these empirical findings, to adjust how we selected immigrants in order to help migrants do better when they first arrive. We've also seen that the positive effect of Canadian work experience prior to obtaining permanent residency has been very beneficial, and that reflects the fact that why we see the Canada Experience class and the provincial nominee program results in the previous slides are so much better. The other thing that we have noticed is that immigrants have a higher propensity to own a private business, but seem to do that and create fewer jobs compared to businesses created by the Canadian born. And we're wondering if that's because some have a harder time finding a job at arrival, so they set up their own company and work for themselves. I want to throw one other point at you before I throw it open to questions, which is I've focused on how newcomers do when they first get here and how they do over time. But the other thing that happens over time is that just like everybody else, newcomers have a life, and they form families and they have children. And when you think about the positive impact of immigration on Canada, you can ask yourself about how well migrants do themselves, but I think it's also important to understand how well their children do. And in general, we see that the educational attainment of newcomer children is very high, but we are starting to see some erosion of the advantage that those children saw in previous data. There are also variations in those outcomes and labor market results by immigration category at arrival and also ethnic origin and visible minority realities. So we're wondering if this may change over time, but I think so long as the children of immigrants do as well as similarly educated Canadian children born of the Canadian born, I'm not too concerned. Canada's universities have responded to a lack of STEM graduates. Those are science, technology, mathematics fields, which were not as prominent within the Canadian education program in the 60s and 70s. Universities have changed since then, and we are now putting out more Canadian-born people to compete with migrants. So I think our standard of measure that a migrant has to do better than the Canadian-born may not be the right benchmark anymore. But I'll leave that to your contemplation and stop there and see if you all have any questions.
I just turned the microphone back on, so if anyone has any questions. I'll start with a question and maybe break the ice a little. Oh, was there a question I missed?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
You mentioned that quantitative analysis that improved maybe economic lives. I was wondering your thoughts about statistical program, right? And if there was any particular that we should highlight for any government.
I'm sorry, Catherine.
You couldn't hear?
No, the question broke up. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So maybe you say there were questions and I'll repeat it here. Okay, so, and tell me if I get it wrong. So the question was whether there were any statistical packages that were advantageous to know when looking for jobs, and in particular programs like R. Is that? Stata, yeah. So what would you suggest brushing up on and highlighting in any application that someone would make to a Canadian government position?
Right. What I would have said before is not what I would say today. Okay. There's been quite a significant improvement in econometric and economic analysis courses over time. And I think you've hit a couple that are really important. R is now being well used in combination with SPSS, which has significantly improved in terms of its ability to ask questions about maximization problems. So I would definitely suggest that R is of great value. Stata packages like that, again, very well rewarded, very helpful. But I would also suggest that you shouldn't forget about simpler things like the Microsoft Office suite and the use of Excel, but particularly more advanced Excel. So use of pivot tables, a lot of information is available that way now, and not all of us old farts, if you will, are good at using that stuff. So being able to manipulate and extract from pivot tables is really helpful as well. The other thing that I would say is being able to display information well is also important. It's not about just putting up a graphic, but being able to explain it and make sure that your storyline is clear is also important. So infographics are increasingly important within communications to senior management. So I wouldn't underestimate the value of those. Hope that's helpful.
Did you have a follow-up question?
Follow-up.
Yep.
Infographics. Do you suggest learning business intelligence platforms like I think IBM actually which one is used, and other than that, like just do you have any specifics that are used?
Okay, so following up on infographics and whether or not there were any particular platforms that you would recommend, like as IBM's Hyperion or things like that.
Yeah, IBM is pretty is in the fore, particularly at IRCC. But what is interesting is we used to use Cognos, and IBM has recently bought them out. So that's a very well-used platform at IRCC. I can't honestly answer that from an other department's perspective. But the other thing that another BI tool that's very popular at the department right now is predictive analytics. And this has to do with risk analysis. Now, this may sound scary to some of you, but we are beginning to automate a lot of our selection processes based on risk assessments. So basically, we're automating as much as we can to be much more efficient. And so understanding risk assessment and how you can use that to automate decision making is also valuable.
Thank you. Other questions? Yep. Okay, so you'd mentioned that economics benefits a lot from, and I couldn't hear the word trending in other disciplines. Yeah, from having the interaction and conversations with other disciplines, and what what in particular you might recommend for students in terms of other courses or readings or other disciplines that they might learn more about.
Yeah, political science has always been, a close ally for economics, and understanding that, particularly if you're interested in working in government. Increasingly, there are two fields that are mandatory within government in terms of being able to do analysis. Those two are environment sustainable development, if you will. So it's useful to understand how sustainable development applies in an economic context. The other type of assessment is what is known as gender-based analysis plus. And this is basically being able to look at diversity within your own domain of expertise. So I'm going to use immigration as an example. Not only do we want to look at whether or not there are differences between men and women, but we want to understand if there are differences as a consequence of where you come from, what your religion is, what the color of your skin is. So all of those factors are important. The other thing that I would stress, particularly in a very people-oriented field is sociology. And the reason that I highlight that is because sociology is about community. It's about a collective as opposed to an individual, which is often the focus of economics. I'm just sitting in the sun, so I'm going to move forward a little bit. It's a good thing to sit in the sun, but not when it's all in your eyes. So being able to understand how to look at a question from a group perspective as opposed to just an individual perspective I have found extremely helpful, because sometimes there is a discrepancy between those two in two areas. One is the type of analysis, the type of analytical tool you might use to examine community results may be very different from the type of empirical tool you might use to examine individual results. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that it's more important to have a general quantitative sense than have knowledge of specific statistical things. Like, so what is the right balance of theory in econometrics and applied work? Don't we like all of that theory in the applied work?
So the question is, you mentioned the importance of general numeracy skills and presentation skills, but how important is the balance between these sorts of skills and the statistical skills, and also the theoretical understanding of those statistics? What balance would you say of knowledge is important to have?
That's a very difficult question because I don't know each one of you. It's important to have a broad understanding, but it's also important to do what you want to do. If your interest is in econometrics, there is a very keen interest within the policy community to hire people who have that degree of quantitative skill. But it's also extremely important to have on your team someone who is a very effective communicator, be that through presentation skills, linguistic skills, what have you. I think at the end of the day, you will be working on a team. And if you have a complementary set of skills, then you should expect to be able to work with someone else. And having some idea about how those other skills complement your own is really where you want to go. I'm not trying to avoid your question. What I don't want to do is suggest that something is more important than something else, because all of the skill sets that are that come from an applied economics background are extremely valuable in the workplace. The expectation for changes in the labor market over time, particularly over the next 10 to 20 years, there is an expectation that there will be increasing demand for people who are capable of doing data analysis. And that is, but that's not a generic, that's a very general term. I think it's important to think about all of the components of that, and to think about how you would fit yourself from an interest perspective in that environment.
Thank you. Yeah. Other questions? Mikhail? Yeah.
So, thank you very much, Martha. This is Mikhail Skidderud. Thanks
Hi,
for
Mikhail.
that.
How are you?
That was excellent, and I think it's really valuable for our students to hear what people do and that the kinds of things that they're learning here are actually used in the real world. So I hadn't fully appreciated the long experience you have doing economic analysis, even outside of the government. So I really enjoyed listening to that. But I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to ask you a little bit, given your extensive background working in CIC and understanding the policy and all the policy changes, to ask, over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been just unbelievable changes in how CIC or IRCC selects immigrants. Do you see that kind of slowing down now? Are we reaching a new kind of steady state in the policy world and in immigration policy in Canada, or do you see this continuing to be an area where things are constantly changing and the targets are moving?
That's a really good question, Mikhail, which I was able to hear. I suspect you're in the front row. I'm going to say yes, but to your question. And I'll give you a sense of where I think things may go. There has been significant upheaval, if you will, in the immigration area, because not just in Canada, it's global. And the reality is that a lot of people are moving. Some people are choosing to move, and some people are being forced to move. Now, I expect that reality to continue, which means that there will be new challenges. I'm particularly thinking about refugees. Today we have refugees because of wars and mostly wars and people not liking each other. So people are afraid that if they stay where they are, they'll be killed. And if I thought that, I'd want to move too. But how do you adjust to a new environment becomes increasingly difficult if you're not able to learn the way the education system is set up in your new environment, or if you don't have proper language skills, if you don't have proper literacy skills. So that's one area where I think there will continue to be significant policy development. Now, economic migrants, I think we've done a lot over time, and I think the challenge on that front will be, how do we work with people who don't actually come to Canada but work here virtually? Now that may sound a little far-fetched, but not so much given the technology we're using today. People work in Canada from overseas already. So if I wanted to go and live in Bora Bora, so long as I had the right technologies, I would be able to contribute from afar. And I think there will be questions to surround that. Now, as you have rightly pointed out, selection policy has changed very rapidly over the last decade or so. And I think the direction that we're moving in will continue, and where we will see change is how the federal government works with the provinces, because the provinces are becoming much more interested as immigration becomes much more important in their local labor markets. So I think those relationships will see a lot of change. But where we're likely to see even more change is on the settlement side of the immigration portfolio. I think there will be a desire to have people settle and integrate faster and better. So the question will be, how do you improve people's language skills more rapidly? How do you ensure that they participate in society? And are there choices that Canadians want to make about how that participation and the degree of that participation? And I'm not sure that we have wrestled with all of those issues particularly well. Now, are those economic issues? Some of them may be in order to speed up integration into the labor market, but I also think that other disciplines will be pulled into the immigration arena, if you will, because I think a lot of political economy and social cohesion questions will come to the fore.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Any research that you found immigration will affect the consumption inequality in Canada?
Could you hear that, Martha?
No.
Okay. So the student was wondering whether you had come across research that suggested that, it was
Immigration will affect the consumption inequality in Canada.
that immigration would or could affect consumption inequality in Canada.
That's a very loaded question, because I'm thinking about the politics around that. But yes, there has been some work in that area. However, most of what I have seen has come out of the human geography literature. So you might want to have a look at that. It's not my area of expertise, but one, like I say, the human geography area might be more helpful for you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
What can you say about the innovation brought in by immigrants?
Okay. Can you speak to the innovation brought in by immigrants to Canada?
Sure. This is another area that is not particularly well quantified. People point to the fact that there is a disproportionate amount of trained immigrants in STEM fields that basically report and have more patents. That's one area that we know that immigrants tend to be better represented. But the other thing that I like to focus on is, and this comes from my ideas about the value of multidisciplinary analysis. If you look at something from a different perspective, and that could be from your different cultural perspective, there's a value in how a team would come to a solution if what is brought to the table is a new idea, a new direction, a new way of doing things that could be pursued. So that's, for me, is very important, particularly in the social science research field. The other area that a lot of others point to in terms of the innovation effects of newcomers is the impact that newcomers have on trade with home countries. Now, this is a bit related to the previous question in terms of consumer preference, a slight twist on the question. What we see is that imports from home countries and exports to home countries are affected by newcomers, even if it's a small group of newcomers from a particular country that come to Canada. So we do see very serious influences on trade, but that also suggests that we see new influences on preferences for goods, because if the variety available is augmented, then people may again be influenced by that change. So I think that the importance of all those different kinds of innovation are real, perhaps not so quantifiable, but at least not directly, but I think of very serious importance.
Thank you. Yep, another question?
Hi, this is Anna Pavel. I don't know if you can hear me, but...
Can you hear?
No.
No, this is Anna Ferrer. Yep.
Oh yes, I know Anna too. Hi.
So my question has to do with language. You have said a couple of times that language is a major thing in terms of assessing how immigrants adapt and assimilate and integrate in our society. So I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific and maybe give us some sneak preview about, programs or data sets or something that is coming from your department that has to do with better assessing or better using these models in terms of language.
So did you get all that?
I think I got most of it.
Okay.
And I know this is a very big interest of yours, and I have to say thank you for that, because increasingly IRCC wants to know how to improve language learning, because it is observed to be so important not only to labor market success but to other social success. We have recently completed and are in the process of publishing an evaluation of our settlement program, a significant proportion of which is spending on language training. And I don't think we're in any way, shape, or form happy with how successful that program is. And I think we have not done enough to say, how do we handle the reality that some newcomers come with very high levels of official language proficiency, while others come with very weak official language proficiency. And I'm not sure that the program is designed as well as it could be to accelerate the settlement process of newcomers. So I think that, I talked about how we're likely to see a lot of movement on the settlement policy side. I think the first target of that is likely to be language, identifying how we can facilitate training of people who are illiterate, distinct from people who have varying degrees of education, and how we can be more proficient in streamlining that training. Secondly, I think we need to understand the difference between language learning of someone whose mother tongue is Mandarin, distinct from Tagalog, distinct from Hindi or Urdu. And the reason I pick on those particular languages is because those are where significant volumes of our newcomers come from. I also think that the nexus between language and culture is an area where we can do better. Maybe we should work more closely with our Quebec colleagues to see if there's something that they have discovered that we have not. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question well. The one thing I will say is there will be a subsequent evaluation specific to our language program. We have recently developed an administrative information data set that we hope will allow us to look into these questions more fruitfully, and the evaluation will be sort of a first look at those results. So if you're interested in pursuing your questions, I would suggest that you contact Umit Kiziltan, who is the Director General of the Evaluation Group, because there will be a lot of information becoming available to not only government researchers but researchers in the academic community.
Thank you. Okay. Any final questions? I have a question for you, actually, and it's a bit of a loaded question as well.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's why you're the moderator, Kathleen.
Right. I get to handle the big guns. So the question is, and it's not meant to be loaded, but the question is, I mean, you talk about identifying problems and then policy solutions and the various disciplines that play into this. So I'm wondering, you know, as students with undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees, as academics, where do we influence this identification of a problem and finding policy solutions? How much of an impact does an academic paper have? How much of an impact can you have working within the Canadian government?
Mm-hmm. Let me first deal with the impact of academic research. If it's well communicated, the value of an academic piece is extremely important. I don't think you can underestimate the value of an academic paper and its contribution to a political debate. Communicating sending the information to government officials is very important, and having the interaction between academics and public policy makers in various fora is extremely important. I'm not sure that the academic world values that as much as the public policy world does, because often papers delivered at public policy conferences are not always as highly valued within the academic community. So we're really thrilled when academics take the opportunity to come and share with us. The second thing that I would say is, if you think about a public career, my public career has allowed me to do things that I would not have otherwise been able to do in a consulting framework. A consulting framework forces you to have a deliverable, and you need to have some success, right? You can't say, oh, well, we tried, but it didn't work. I have found that in government, you can sometimes you can fail. You're not able to succeed in developing information that's of any significant quality. I've worked with Statistics Canada over time, and sometimes we don't get it right. And I think that's that's a real plus. I would like to see more fora, not unlike Anna has enlivened the labor market forum, which I'm very happy to participate in, and I would, even though it's joined with the Canadian Economics Association meetings, it's there's a lot of interest within the government community to participate in those events. I would like to see more academics participate in those events where academics may not get as many kudos from their institutions, and maybe we need to work together to find more strategic ways to organize those activities. I'm a big fan of using the academic community for peer review. A multidisciplinary environment can be very challenging, and it's very easy to take a misstep without the welcome contribution of theoretically correct academics. So I see it as an extremely complementary activity, and I think my career speaks to that. I've always worked very closely with the academic world.
Thank you. That was really great to hear, and it's also really great to hear your perspective on failure, because it feels like with a lot of policy we have to feel our way, and not being able to make those mistakes, I think, would be a problem.
Make a phone call. You'd be surprised who will listen.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for all of your fantastic questions. Any last minute questions, comments? Oh, yeah, yes.
She mentioned that she has private experience and public experience.
Yes.
So my question would be, what would you say is the biggest difference between the government work and large corporation work?
Did you hear?
Yes. I think the big difference, and it depends on the government of the day, but I think the fact that you can experiment and fail outside business. Now, in a scientific environment within business, failure is a reality. But in the social sciences front, there is an expectation that you will have a forecast, you will have something that you will stand behind. Within government, that's not necessarily the case. So experimentation on the social science front is really a significant difference. One final point that I'm going to put my money where my mouth is here. If you have questions and you want to follow up with me, please do so. You can get my email from Kathleen or from Anna or Mikhail. I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Thank you so much, Martha. This has been fantastic. And everyone, please help me in thanking.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll sign off now, but we'll be sending you an email shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.